Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to another exciting literary journey on our channel. Today I'm going to tell you a story that touches the heart and makes us reflect on the strength of love in difficult times. It's a narrative about improbable encounters, about how three small lives can transform the destiny of people marked by solitude. A story of hope born in the cruelest ice of the American winter of 1876. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching us from? Has your city also experienced harsh winters like the ones we're going to learn about today? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like. This helps us a lot to continue bringing these moving stories to you. Montana, American territory, winter of 1876. 3 lives in the ice. The wind cut the skin like sharp blades that December morning when Benjamin Crawford walked along the banks of the Clearwater River. His steps sank into the snow that had covered the world for weeks, transforming Montana into a white and silent canvas. Ben carried with him more than just the weight of his 40-something years. He carried the invisible scars of a war that had ended more than a decade ago, but still bled in his soul. An ex-Confederate soldier, he had found refuge for his solitude in those wild lands. The grayish beard framed a face marked by time and loss, blue eyes that had already seen too much, calloused hands that knew both the delicacy and brutality of life. That morning, like so many others, he had gone out to check his traps, looking for something to supplement his meager winter supplies. That's when he heard it, a sound so fragile that for a moment he thought it was just the moan of wind through the pines. He stopped, tilting his head, and heard it again. It wasn't the wind, it was something human, something desperately alive fighting against winter's deadly silence. He followed the sound to a bend in the river, where the ice had formed thinner, creating a translucent crust over the dark water. There, half buried in the snow of the bank, lay a military canvas sack, the type used during the war that Ben knew all too well. The thick fabric was rigid from the cold, but from inside came that sound, a weak cry, almost inaudible. Ben's hands trembled, not just from the cold, as he untied the sack's ropes with numb fingers. When he opened the fabric, his heart stopped for an instant. 3 small bodies, newborn babies, huddled against each other in an instinctive attempt to share what little warmth they had left. Their skin was bluish, lips almost purple, but they were breathing, still breathing. A girl and 2 boys so small they looked like porcelain dolls broken by the cold. The girl in the center had a crescent-shaped birthmark on her left temple. The twins, clearly brothers by the similarity of their features, were too thin, too fragile. Without hesitation, Ben removed his fur coat and wrapped the 3 babies against his chest. The contrast between his body's warmth and the children's coldness was like an electric shock. He needed to get them somewhere warm and fast. The town of Silverbrook was 2 miles away, and the Eagle's Rest Tavern would be his only hope. He carried the babies as if they were made of crystal, running through the snow with a determination he hadn't felt in years. Each step was a fight against time and against the death that stalked those small lives. The wind howled around him, but Ben only heard the irregular beating of 3 tiny hearts fighting to continue. When he finally reached the tavern, he burst through the door with all the force of a desperate man. The interior's warmth enveloped him like an embrace, and he cried for help with a voice that echoed through the establishment's wooden beams. But had he arrived in time? And who would have abandoned 3 innocents in a sack at the banks of a frozen river? The Eagle's Rest Tavern was instantly transformed into an improvised hospital. Catherine Sullivan, an Irish nurse passing through the town, took command with the efficiency of someone who had seen too much pain and death. Her expert hands moved with surgical precision, checking fragile pulses, observing the color of the small fingernails, whispering prayers in Gaelic as she worked. "Diluted whiskey," she ordered Ben, who remained paralyzed by the fireplace. "And hot cloths. We need to warm these babies slowly, or the shock could kill them." Dr. Augustus Hartwell, the town's retired military doctor, arrived minutes later, his leather bag hitting his leg as he crossed through the snow. He was a 50-year-old man, white hair combed back, steady hands that had already sewn more soldiers than he liked to remember. He looked at the 3 babies and nodded gravely. "Severe hypothermia," he murmured, placing the stethoscope on each child's chest. "But there's hope. The youngest of the twins is worse. His lungs make a worrying sound." The following hours were a delicate dance between life and death. Catherine heated water in pots over the fire, preparing warm baths to gradually raise the baby's body temperature. Ben remained seated in a nearby chair, watching every movement, every breath, as if his own vigilance could keep those lives anchored to the world. The girl was the first to react. Her eyes opened, large and grey like the winter sky, and she emitted a whimper that sounded like celestial music in the silent tavern. Ben felt something break in his chest, a wall he had built around his heart during years of solitude. "She's going to live," Catherine whispered, smiling for the first time since arriving. "This little warrior is going to live." The stronger twin recovered next, his small fists closing with determination as he protested against the cold that still inhabited his bones. But the third baby, the smallest of the boys, remained dangerously quiet, his irregular breathing creating almost invisible clouds in the air. When morning came, painting the tavern windows with golden tones, the three babies were stable, weak, but alive. Ben had spent the entire night awake, watching them sleep in improvised baskets near the fireplace, covered with the best blankets the establishment could offer. "They need names," Catherine said softly, adjusting a little blanket over the girl. "Names give strength, create identity." Ben looked at the three small faces and felt a connection he couldn't explain. "James," he said, pointing to the stronger twin. "Emma," he murmured, gently touching the girl's forehead. "And William," he concluded, looking at the most fragile baby with infinite tenderness. Dr. Hartwell interrupted the moment. "Ben, you know you can't keep them. There are 3 children. They need to go to the Fort Benton orphanage, where they'll have adequate care." But Ben shook his head with a firmness that surprised himself. "No, they're not going anywhere. Someone abandoned them to die, and I brought them back to life. That means something. That means they're mine now." His words echoed through the tavern like a solemn promise. But outside, in Silverbrook's frozen streets, news of his decision was beginning to spread like fire in dry straw, and not everyone in the town looked favorably upon an ex-Confederate's determination to raise 3 orphans. Margaret Whitmore, widow of the former mayor and leader of the local temperance league, was already formulating plans that would transform Ben's life into a hell of judgments and prejudices. But for now, in the morning's golden quietude, 3 small lives breathed peacefully, ignorant of the approaching storm. Margaret Whitmore was the type of woman who transformed her own pain into a weapon against the world. At 55, she had buried her husband in a typhus epidemic 2 winters before, and since then had dedicated her widowed energy to molding Silverbrook according to her vision of morality. Greyish hair pulled back in a severe bun, dark dresses that never revealed a centimetre of skin beyond what was necessary, she commanded the Temperance League with an iron fist wrapped in lace gloves. The morning after the baby's rescue, she convened a meeting at the Methodist Church. The small wooden building filled quickly, not just with the League's usual members, but with curious merchants, housewives seeking novelty, and some men who disguised ancient prejudices behind masks of civic concern. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret began, her voice cutting the church's cold air like a well-sharpened blade, "we need to discuss this situation with Mr. Crawford, a single man, ex-Confederate soldier, who decides to raise 3 orphaned children without consulting our community." Murmurs traveled through the wooden pews. Silverbrook was a town where everyone knew everyone's story, and the Civil War still created sensitive wounds even a decade later. Ben had arrived there 5 years before, a solitary man who bought a small property in the hills and rarely mingled with the other inhabitants. "What kind of environment can such a man offer to innocent children?" Margaret continued, her pale hands gesticulating dramatically. "A man who fought to keep human beings enslaved now wants to raise 3 orphans? Where is the Christian logic in this?" But not everyone in the town shared her indignation. Thomas Anderson, a Union veteran who worked as a blacksmith, slowly rose. He was a big man, with broad shoulders molded by years of forging iron, blonde hair already thinning at 45. "With all due respect, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his deep voice resonating through the wooden walls, "I saw Ben Crawford throw himself into a semi-frozen river to save 3 babies. I don't care which side of the war he chose. A man who risks his life for unknown children deserves our support, not our judgment." The tension in the church became palpable. The war's old divisions, which seemed dormant, awakened like poorly healed wounds. Some women from the League whispered among themselves, casting disapproving glances toward Thomas. Other inhabitants, especially those of immigrant origin, Irish, Germans, Scandinavians, seemed divided between sympathy for the orphans and fear of challenging the established social structure. During the following days, Silverbrook transformed into an invisible arena of silent battles. Margaret organized a discreet boycott of the supplies Ben would need to care for the children. The general store, controlled by one of the League members, began to forget to separate Ben's orders, or claimed lack of stock when he appeared. But an underground network of solidarity also formed. Catherine Sullivan, who decided to extend her stay in the town, appeared at Ben's property with baskets of food and medical supplies. Working families left fresh milk, cloth diapers and baby clothes on his cabin's porch during the early morning hours. Dr. Hartwell, despite his initial reservations, became a regular visitor, monitoring the three babies' development with professional care that hid growing affection. William, the more fragile twin, developed mild pneumonia that required constant care, creating an even stronger bond between the doctor and the children. Ben found himself living a completely transformed life. His mornings began before sunrise, heating goat's milk, preparing oatmeal porridge, changing diapers with large, clumsy hands that quickly learned to be gentle. His nights were punctuated by cries that woke him instantly, leading him to walk through the cabin, humming lullabies his own mother had taught him decades before. The small two-room cabin transformed into a home. Ben built 3 improvised cribs with pine wood, carving small drawings on the headboards, a crescent moon for Emma, corresponding to her birthmark, a small anchor for James, who seemed to have a sailor's determination, and a little bird for William, whose fragility hid a persistent soul. But external pressures were growing. Margaret Whitmore wrote to the Fort Benton orphanage, demanding they send someone to evaluate the situation. She spread rumors about an ex-Confederate's suitability to raise children, questioning his morality and intentions. It was on a January afternoon, when snow fell heavy as frozen tears, that Ben discovered the true scope of the campaign against him. Returning from town with medical supplies for William, he found a note nailed to his cabin door. "Men like you don't deserve the blessing of raising innocent lives. Abandon the children or abandon Silverbrook. This is your last warning." Inside the cabin, 3 babies slept peacefully, oblivious to the storm forming around their small lives. Ben looked at them and felt fierce determination grow in his chest. He had lost his wife and child in the war. A fever that swept the Confederate camp took them while he was at the battlefront. He wouldn't lose anyone else he loved. But a shadow moved in the forest margins, watching the cabin. Someone was coming to Silverbrook, someone who would change everything Ben thought he knew about the 3 small miracles he had saved from the ice. Sarah Mitchell's arrival in Silverbrook was like a ghost's entrance into an already rehearsed play. She arrived in a mud-stained postal carriage one February afternoon, when the ice began yielding ground to the first timid promises of spring. She was a 22-year-old woman, reddish hair like autumn fire escaping from a bun maltreated by travel, green eyes that carried the weight of ancient sufferings. Ben was at the Eagle's Rest Tavern when she entered, seeking information about 3 babies found in the river. His heart stopped when she perfectly described Emma's birthmark, a crescent moon on the left temple. No one else knew of that detail, except those present at the rescue. "I'm their mother," Sarah said simply, her voice carrying a soft Irish accent mixed with something more, formal education that seemed to clash with her simple clothes and the fatigue stamped on her young face. The tavern fell completely silent. Catherine Sullivan, who was serving drinks, stopped with the tray suspended in air. Dr. Hartwell, playing cards at a nearby table, raised his eyes over his glasses with scientific interest. And Ben felt the world collapse and rebuild itself at the same time. Sarah told her story in a low voice, words that fell like stones in a deep well. She had been a governess at the Ashworth property, a rich San Francisco family. Richard Ashworth Jr., the boss's son, had taken advantage of her vulnerable position. When they discovered her pregnancy, the family expelled her without references, without money, carrying only shame and the promise that she would be hunted if she tried to return. "I traveled east, seeking my family in Ireland," she continued, her hands trembling slightly as she held a cup of hot tea. "But the birth was complicated. 3 babies in a lodge in Virgin Territory, only a drunk midwife to help. When I regained consciousness, they told me my children had died, that they took them to bury. The lie had been cruel but efficient. The lodge, controlled by men paid by the Ashworth family, had made Sarah believe her children were dead, while in truth they abandoned them in a sack at the riverbanks, hoping Montana's winter would complete the job they hadn't had the courage to finish. "How did you discover they were alive?" Ben asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "One of the men got drunk in a Helena tavern and told the truth to impress a woman. The news reached me through traders. 3 babies saved from the river by a lonely veteran. I needed to come, needed to know. Ben looked at that young woman and saw reflections of himself, someone marked by loss, by betrayal, by the cruel world that transformed love into weapon and innocence into burden. But he also saw strength, the same fierce determination that had led him to break ice with his bare hands that December morning. "You want to take them," he said. It wasn't a question. "They're my children," Sarah replied, but her voice carried more desperation than conviction. "But I have nothing. I have no way to support them. The Ashworth family made sure I could never get decent work again." It was Catherine who broke the silence that followed. "Maybe you don't need to decide this now. The babies are well cared for. You both clearly love them. Wouldn't it be possible? A partnership?" The suggestion floated in the air like tobacco smoke, creating possibilities none of them had considered. Ben thought of recent months. The dawns awake with sick William, the afternoons teaching Emma to hold objects, the mornings watching James discover his own fingers. He also thought of the solitude that had consumed him before, and how 3 small lives had filled spaces in his soul he didn't even know were empty. Sarah thought of months of desperation, seeking work in hostile territories, sleeping in stables and eating scraps when she could. She thought of the piercing pain of believing her children were dead and the impossible miracle of discovering they lived. "The Ashworth family men are still looking for me," Sarah said finally. "If they find out I found the children, that they're alive, they'll come here, and it won't be to talk." Ben nodded slowly. He knew well the type of man the rich family would hire to solve their problems. He had seen enough during the war to know that money bought consciences, and that people like Sarah and her children were considered disposable. "Then we have a bigger problem than Margaret Whitmore and her Temperance League," Dr. Hartwell murmured, joining the conversation. "Much bigger," Sarah agreed, "and they're coming. I saw 2 men following me in the last 3 towns. They're not common travelers. They're hunters, and now they know where I am." Ben felt familiar coldness settle in his chest, the same he felt before battles during the war. He looked at Sarah, at Catherine, at Dr. Hartwell, and made a decision that would change everything. "Then we're not going to wait for them," he said simply. "We're leaving Silverbrook before they arrive." The journey that was about to begin would test not only their courage, but also the bonds forming between people shaped by adversity and united by the need to protect 3 small, innocent lives. Preparation for departure was done in silence and urgency. Ben had learned during the war that survival depended on careful planning and quick execution. Sarah proved more resilient than her delicate appearance suggested, organizing medical supplies and baby clothes with military efficiency. Thomas Anderson appeared at the cabin on the eve of departure, carrying a backpack and rifle. "You'll need someone who knows the mountain trails," he said simply, accepting no protests. "And I owe some favors to good men, regardless of which side of the war they chose." Dr. E.D. Hartwell contributed medications and detailed instructions on how to treat medical emergencies. Catherine sewed special bags that would allow carrying the babies safely during the ride. Margaret Whitmore, discovering the preparations through her network of informants, attempted one last maneuver to prevent departure, sending a telegram to Fort Benton alleging kidnapping of orphans. But they departed before dawn, when Silverbrook still slept under a silver snowmantle. Ben carried Emma in an improvised baby carrier on his chest. Sarah carried James the same way. William, still fragile but improving, traveled in a special basket tied to Thomas's saddle, who followed in the rear watching for signs of pursuit. The trail serpentined through gigantic pines, whose branches curved under the weight of accumulated snow. The mountain's silence was absolute, broken only by the muffled sound of hooves in snow and the horses' breathing creating vapor clouds in the frozen air. The babies, protected by layers of furs and blankets, slept lulled by the ride's rhythmic movement. On the second day, the storm arrived. The wind rose like a furious animal, whipping snow in blinding whirlwinds. Temperature plummeted to dangerous levels, and even the horses began showing signs of exhaustion. William developed a worrying cough that echoed fragilely through the wind's howling. "We need to find shelter," Thomas shouted over the storm, pointing to a rock formation on the mountain slope. "I know a cave there. It's not luxurious, but it'll keep us alive." The cave was larger than expected, with an opening that allowed making fire without filling the space with smoke. Thomas and Ben collected dry wood, while Sarah tended to William, whose cough worsened with worrying speed. The young mother sang lullabies in Gaelic, her sweet voice creating a bubble of tranquility amid the storm raging outside. It was during the second night in the cave that they heard the wolves. The howl echoed through the mountains like an ancestral lament, answered by other howls coming from different directions. Thomas knew that sound, a large pack, hungry, moving through the mountains, seeking scarce food at winter's end. "They can smell the horses," he whispered, checking his rifle. "And maybe other things." Ben understood immediately. Wolves were smart enough to recognize when humans were vulnerable, especially with small children. He checked his own weapon and positioned himself at the cave entrance, Sarah grouping the 3 babies behind him. Eyes appeared first in the darkness, yellow points shining like malevolent stars beyond the firelight's reach. 1, 2, 5. Ben counted at least 8 pairs before stopping. The pack was too large to face in direct combat. The alpha wolf appeared at the light's edge, a magnificent and terrible animal with silver-gray fur and scars that told stories of previous battles. He observed the humans with calculating intelligence, evaluating strength, weakness, opportunity. Thomas fired into the air, the shot's sound echoing through the mountains like thunder. The wolves retreated but didn't flee. They remained there, patient, waiting. The night became a tense vigil. Ben and Thomas took turns on guard while Sarah kept the babies calm, whispering Irish stories to Emma, who remained awake, watching the flames with childish fascination. William improved slightly, his cough diminishing with the fire's warmth. When dawn finally came, painting the mountains with rosy tones, the wolves had disappeared. But in the fresh snow around the cave, footprints told a different story. They had circled the shelter all night, seeking weak points, testing defenses. "We need to move," Thomas said, quickly packing supplies. "Wolves are persistent. They'll follow our trail." But there was another problem. In the distance, through binoculars Thomas carried, they could see small, dark points moving along the trail they had traveled. Riders. The Ashworth family men had finally arrived. The hunt had begun. The pursuit transformed into a deadly dance through the frozen gorges of the Rocky Mountains. Thomas knew every trail, every shortcut, every cave that could offer tactical advantage. But the pursuers were professionals, men hired to solve problems without leaving witnesses, equipped with fresh horses and abundant supplies. For 3 days, Ben's group maneuvered through the mountains like ghosts, leaving false tracks, constantly changing direction, using frozen streams to mask their trail. Sarah proved surprisingly adaptable to wildlife, her formal education revealing itself useful when identifying edible plants or predicting weather changes by observing bird behavior. The babies, wrapped in bear furs Thomas had brought, adapted to the journey's rhythm with childhood's natural flexibility. Emma developed a heart-melting smile when she saw fresh snow. James showed fascination with horses, extending small hands to touch their manes. William, though still fragile, gained color in his cheeks with the mountain's pure air. But the circle was closing. On the 3rd day's afternoon, they reached Devil's Canyon Pass, a narrow gorge between 2 mountains, offering the only passage to the valley where Jake Morrison's trading post stood, Ben's old comrade. It was an ideal location for ambush, but also the only available route before the next storm reached them. Thomas studied the terrain through binoculars, his grave expression becoming somber. "They arrived first," he murmured. "They positioned themselves on the high rocks on both sides. They turned our only exit into a trap." Ben looked at Sarah, who held James to her chest while cradling William in an improvised basket. The determination in her green eyes mirrored his own. They had come too far, invested too much love in those 3 small lives to give up now. "How many?" Ben asked, checking his ammunition. "I saw at least 4, probably more hidden. Well-chosen positions. Whoever their leader is understands military tactics." Sarah approached the 2 men, speaking in a low but firm voice. "There's something I didn't tell you about Richard Ashworth, Jr. He's not just a spoiled rich family son. He served as an officer in the Union Army, specialized in siege operations. He knows Ben by war reputation." The revelation fell like a cold stone in Ben's stomach. This wasn't just about silencing a troublesome governess, it was personal. Ashworth had planned that pursuit as a military hunt, using knowledge of Ben's past to anticipate his movements. "So, he knows I won't abandon the children," Ben said, understanding the trap's depth. "And he knows I'll try to cross the gorge even knowing it's an ambush." Thomas spat in the snow. "Arrogant man, but every tactic has weakness. We just need to find it." The solution came from an unexpected source. Sarah remembered stories her grandfather told about Irish guerrilla tactics against the English, "What if we don't try to cross?" she suggested. "What if we force them to come to us?" The idea was bold and dangerous. They would make fire in an exposed position, creating enough smoke to seem like they were camping for the night. When Ashworth and his men descended to attack, Thomas and Ben would be positioned on lateral rocks, creating crossfire. Sarah would remain hidden with the children in a nearby cave, with instructions to follow an alternative trail if the plan failed. The young Irish woman held Ben's face between her hands before he left for position. "So you returned my children to me," she whispered. "Now I'm going to make you promise you'll return to them." "I promise," Ben said, and sealed the promise with a gentle kiss on her forehead, the first romantic gesture between them, born from the need to affirm life in the face of possible death. The ambush happened at sunset, when the sun created long shadows among rocks. Ashworth descended first, a tall man in impeccable military uniform, followed by 4 well-armed mercenaries. All moved with military precision, covering angles, communicating by signals. When they discovered the fire was just a distraction, it was too late. Ben and Thomas emerged from lateral positions, their weapons drawing confrontation lines in the frozen air. But Ashworth was smarter than expected. He had left 2 shooters in high positions as rear guard. The gunfight that followed echoed through the gorge like mountain thunder. Ben felt a bullet pass close enough to burn his cheek. Thomas cried out when a projectile hit his left shoulder. But they had tactical advantage and motivation stronger than money. They were protecting family. The confrontation ended when Ashworth, wounded in the leg and seeing his men fallen or retreating, shouted across the gorge, "This doesn't end here, Crawford. The Ashworth family has influence extending far beyond these mountains." But his voice carried defeat's bitterness. Ben emerged from his position, rifle still aimed, and responded with the calm of a man who had found his cause. "If you try to touch them again, you'll discover that ex-Confederates also know how to protect what they love." When they reached Jake Morrison's trading post 3 hours later, carrying wounded but conscious Thomas, they were a family forged by fire and united by bonds stronger than blood. The 3 children had slept through the entire confrontation, protected by the fierce determination of adults who learned that love sometimes demands war. Jake Morrison, a bearded veteran who traded furs and supplies on the frontier, received them with hot whiskey and clean beds. Looking at the improbable group, soldiers from opposite sides of the war, a young Irish woman, 3 orphaned babies, he smiled with the wisdom of someone who had lived long enough to recognize when witnessing something special. "Welcome to my humble establishment," he said. "From what I heard of the gunfight in the gorge, you deserve more than hospitality. You deserve celebration, but there was still a final battle to come, a battle that would be fought not with weapons, but with laws, witnesses, and truth's transformative power." Jake Morrison's trading post temporarily transformed into a sanctuary where wounds healed and plans formed. Thomas recovered quickly. The bullet had passed through shoulder muscle without damaging bones. Sarah cared for him and the babies with equal dedication, her hands revealing medical training she hadn't mentioned before. "I learned from the nuns at the convent where I studied," she explained, while changing Thomas's bandages. "They said an educated woman should know how to save lives, not just adorn them." Ben watched her work, fascinated by the combination of gentleness and competence. Sarah possessed layers of history that revealed themselves gradually, like petals of a flowering bloom. Each new discovery about her deepened feelings Ben hadn't experienced in years. Jake Morrison, however, brought troubling news from the outside world. "Received word through the trading network," he said one morning while preparing strong coffee. "The Ashworth family ain't giving up. They're taking this to court, claiming those babies were kidnapped from them." The strategy was diabolical in its simplicity. The Ashworths claimed Sarah had stolen the children from their property and that Ben was accomplice in the kidnapping. With money and influence, they could buy witnesses, bribe authorities, transform victims into criminals. "But we have the truth," Sarah said, her voice carrying more hope than certainty. "Truth is luxury poor folks can't afford in courts," Jake replied dryly. "You need more than truth. You need evidence, respectable witnesses, and a lawyer who won't bow to Ashworth money." The solution came through an unexpected network of allies. Dr. Hartwell arrived at the trading post 2 weeks later, carrying more than medical supplies. He brought letters, written testimonies from dismissed Ashworth property employees confirming the abusive treatment given to Sarah, medical records documenting the baby's physical condition when found, and a support network including veterans from both sides of the war. "Silverbrook changed after you left," the doctor related while examining the children. Margaret Whitmore lost much of her influence when people learned she was paid by the Ashworths to organize opposition to you. Thomas Anderson returned with stories of your heroism, and sentiment shifted. Catherine Sullivan had organized an epistolary campaign, writing to Eastern newspapers interested in frontier stories. The case gained national notoriety when the Eastern Observer published an article titled "3 Lives in Ice, A Tale of Redemption and Family on the American Frontier." The trial was scheduled to happen in Helena, territorial capital, before a federal judge. It was a partial victory. Local courts could be easily influenced by the Ashworths, but federal jurisdiction offered fairer chance. The journey to Helena was a triumphal procession that grew along the way. Families of Irish and Scandinavian immigrants joined the group, offering escort and moral support. Union and Confederate veterans rode side by side, united by mutual respect that transcended old divisions. Emma, James, and William, now almost a year old, became small celebrities. Emma had taken her first wobbling steps at the trading post. James had spoken his first word, "Papa," directed at Ben. William, overcoming his initial fragility, developed a sweet but determined personality that melted hearts wherever they passed. In Helena, crowds gathered to witness what newspapers called the trial of the century. The courthouse, a wooden building that also served as territorial legislative assembly, filled up. The outside filled with supporters carrying banners with phrases like "Justice for the children" and "Family is love, not blood." The Ashworth lawyer, an elegant Boston man with reputation of never losing cases against common people, opened with arguments painting Sarah as liar and Ben as kidnapper, motivated by greed. They claimed the babies were legitimate property of the Ashworth family, born on their lands by their employee. But the defense lawyer, a local veteran named Samuel Morrison, Jake's cousin, built a case that transcended technical legalities. He called witnesses who spoke about evident love between Ben, Sarah, and the children. Dr. Hartwell presented detailed medical evidence about the baby's condition when found. Catherine Sullivan described the devoted care she had observed. The decisive moment came when Sarah took the stand. With clear, firm voice, she told her story without omitting painful details. She spoke about abuse, forced abandonment, and the agony of believing her children were dead. When she described the reunion moment with them, there wasn't a dry eye in the audience. "These are not property," she said, looking directly at the jury. "They are my children, saved by a good man who saw 3 babies dying and chose love over convenience. If that's kidnapping, then I pray more people become kidnappers." Ben also testified, speaking about the morning that changed his life. His gruff voice broke slightly when he described breaking ice to save 3 small strangers and how they had filled spaces in his soul he didn't even know were empty. The trial lasted 3 days. When the jury returned with verdict of not guilty and recommendation for legal shared custody, the explosion of joy in the courthouse echoed through Helena's streets. But the real victory was in the faces of 3 children who finally had a guaranteed future, and in the hearts of adults who discovered that family is built with love, not blood. The spring of 1877 came to Montana like a fulfilled promise. Snow melted into musical streams that sang through the mountains, and the first green shoots speckled fields that had remained dormant during the long winter. For Ben, Sarah, and the 3 children, it was more than seasonal change. It was rebirth. With money raised during the support campaign and an unexpected donation from Jake Morrison, they bought property near the Yellowstone River. The land was rich and well located, with a main cabin that needed repairs but offered enough space for a growing family, horse stables, and fields for cultivation. Sarah revealed herself surprisingly skilled in agricultural planning, another residue of her formal education that proved useful in practical life. Ben discovered that his years of solitude had perfected carpentry and construction skills that now served to create a true home. They worked side by side during spring's long days, he building fences and renovating the cabin, she planning gardens and organizing the interior. The 3 children played among them, Emma trying to imitate Sarah's movements in the garden, James fascinated by Ben's hammers and nails, William content simply observing everything with large, curious eyes. Thomas Anderson visited regularly, his shoulder completely recovered and his heart clearly captivated by Catherine Sullivan, who had decided to establish an itinerant medical clinic in the region. Dr. Hartwell became a constant presence, officially to monitor the children's development, unofficially because he considered Ben and Sarah the family he never had. Evenings were the most precious moments. After simple but substantial dinner, the family gathered in the cabin's main room. Sarah sang Irish songs while sewing clothes for the children. Ben carved small wooden toys, horses for James, a doll for Emma, a little bird for William. The children slept piled like puppies in a large bed Ben had built especially for them. It was on one of those nights, when Emma fell asleep in Ben's lap and James yawned against Sarah's shoulder, that she made an observation that changed everything. William still doesn't have an official surname. Ben looked at the youngest child, who had become especially close to him due to constant medical care during the first months. William was small for his age, but compensated in personality, a smile that illuminated any environment, and a way of looking at the world as if everything were miracle. Neither Emma, neither James, Sarah added softly. Legal records list them only as orphans under our custody. The implication floated in the air like wildflower perfume. Ben and Sarah had become partners in raising the children, but still hadn't formally defined what they were to each other. They shared responsibilities, decisions, even occasional demonstrations of affection, but always carefully, like people walking on ice that could break at any moment. "Sarah," Ben said finally, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know much about pretty words or romantic promises, but I know that when I look at you and these children, I see the only future I want to have." Sarah put James in his crib and turned to Ben completely. Her green eyes shone in the fireplace's golden light. "Benjamin Crawford," she said, using his full name for the first time, "you saved me as much as you saved my children. You returned a family to me, a purpose, a reason to believe good things can still happen." The marriage proposal was made in frontier style, direct, honest, without artifices. Ben asked if Sarah would accept being his wife, not just for convenience or the children, but because he had fallen in love with her during their shared journey. Sarah responded by kissing him softly, a kiss that tasted of future promises and finally possible dreams. They married 3 weeks later, in a simple ceremony held in the new property's garden. Thomas served as best man, Catherine as maid of honor. Dr. Hartwell conducted the ceremony, having been ordained as minister in his youth before embracing medicine. The 3 children, dressed in new clothes Sarah had sewn, served as the most important audience. Jake Morrison arrived with practical gifts, garden seeds, agricultural tools, and a special surprise, adoption papers, prepared by his lawyer cousin. Ben and Sarah could officially adopt Emma, James, and William as their children, giving them the Crawford surname and permanent place in a family that chose them. The wedding celebration extended through the night, with violin music played by an Irish miner, abundant food prepared by neighbors who had become chosen family, and stories told around a campfire that painted happy faces with golden light. When they finally were alone, Ben and Sarah, now officially husband and wife with 3 children sleeping peacefully in their cribs, they remained seated on the cabin porch, watching stars that seemed like blessings scattered across Montana's sky. "Do you think they'll remember?" Sarah asked softly, referring to the children's dramatic first months. "I hope they don't remember the cold or fear," Ben replied. "But I hope they always remember they were chosen, loved, fought for. I hope they remember that family isn't just where you're born, but where you decide to belong." The future stretched before them like a golden road, full of hard work, inevitable challenges, but also replete with possibilities that seemed limitless when faced together. The first year as official Crawford family brought routines that settled on the property like deep roots in fertile soil. Ben discovered that being father to 3 small children demanded more energy than any military campaign had required, but also offered sweeter rewards than any battlefield victory. Emma developed into a determined and independent girl, with reddish hair like her mother's and blue eyes like Ben's. She had become the family's explorer, constantly discovering new corners of the property, collecting interesting stones and wildflowers she offered as precious gifts. Her moon-shaped birthmark had become a symbol of luck for the family. Ben used to kiss it lightly before Emma fell asleep, whispering that she was the moon that illuminated their nights. James transformed into the family's little engineer. Fascinated by how things worked, he disassembled any object he could reach, studying its parts with comic seriousness for a 2-year-old. Ben began teaching him about simple tools, watching with paternal pride as James tried to imitate his movements during construction projects. William remained the gentlest of the 3, but his initial fragility had given way to quiet strength that surprised visitors. He was the one who consoled his siblings when they cried, who noticed when adults were worried, who offered spontaneous hugs that seemed to heal any emotional wound. "Doctor, Hartwell frequently commented that William possessed natural medical instincts, an intuition about caring for others that couldn't be taught. Sarah flourished in motherhood, like a plant that finally found adequate soil. Her mornings began singing Irish songs while preparing strong coffee and oatmeal porridge. She established small traditions that gave rhythm to days: stories after breakfast, garden work before lunch, quiet time when children rested during summer's hot afternoons. Ben adapted to fatherhood with the same meticulous dedication he applied to everything in life. He built swings in oak trees near the house, carved small wooden animals during winter nights, and developed infinite patience to answer constant questions from 3 curious, developing minds. The property prospered along with the family. Fields planted with wheat and barley promised abundant harvest. Sarah's garden produced enough vegetables for the family and to sell at Helena's market. Ben had established a small horse breeding operation that was beginning to gain reputation in the region, but it was during the second autumn on the property that they faced their first real test as established family. A diphtheria epidemic swept the region, especially affecting small children. Dr. Hartwell appeared at the property on a grey October afternoon, his grave expression carrying news that made Ben and Sarah's hearts stop. "I need to quarantine you," he said without preambles. "The disease has already reached 5 families in the valley. 2 children died. I can't allow it to spread further." The quarantine lasted 6 weeks that tested every aspect of their family life. Confined to the property without contact with the outside world, they needed to be completely self-sufficient. Ben hunted deer and wild birds to guarantee sufficient protein. Sarah carefully rationed medical supplies and preserved foods. The children, too young to fully understand the situation's gravity, transformed quarantine into adventure. Emma organized expeditions to different parts of the property. James built elaborate cities with wooden blocks Ben had carved. William developed a game where he pretended to be doctor, examining his siblings and adults with adorable seriousness. It was during that isolated time that Ben and Sarah discovered how deeply compatible they were, not just as parents, but as companions. Long nights filled with conversations ranging from practical plans for the property to dreams for the children's future. Sarah taught Ben some words in Gaelic. He shared stories about places he had seen during the war. When Dr. Hartwell finally lifted the quarantine, declaring them healthy and free of diphtheria, the Crawford family had emerged stronger and more unified. They had passed their first major test as family unit, not just surviving hardships, but growing closer through them. But while they looked toward the future with renewed optimism, none of them suspected that distant forces were already conspiring to threaten again the happiness they had conquered with such sacrifice. The spring of 1878 brought more than wildflowers and melted snow to the valley. It brought changes that would transform not just the Crawford family's life, but the entire region. News that the railroad would reach Montana within 2 years spread like wildfire, bringing speculators, new settlers, and opportunities that seemed unlimited. Ben received the first indication of how popular his family had become when a delegation of Helena businessmen appeared at the property one April morning. Led by a banker named Harrison Whitfield, no relation to the infamous Margaret Whitmore, they came with a proposal that seemed too good to be true. "Mr. Crawford," Whitfield said, removing his hat while observing the 3 children playing in the yard, "your story has become quite famous in the East. People were inspired by your rescue of those babies and the way you and your wife built a life together. We want to offer you a partnership in an enterprise that could benefit everyone." The proposal was ambitious. A planned community centered on values the Crawford family represented: cooperation between former enemies, care for orphaned children, integration of different immigrant groups. Whitfield and his partners wanted to establish a town near the Crawford property, using their story as marketing tool to attract settlers who valued community over individual gain. Sarah listened carefully as the men outlined their plans. Her education and business sense, developed during her time as governess in a wealthy household, allowed her to identify both opportunities and potential pitfalls in the proposal. "And what exactly do you expect from us in return?" she asked, her Irish accent more pronounced when being particularly cautious. "Simply continue being who you are," Whitfield responded. "Allow us to feature your story in our promotional materials. Participate in town planning. Maybe help establish a school where children from all backgrounds can learn together." Ben was intrigued but cautious. He had seen enough schemes during his military days to know promises frequently crumbled when tested by reality. but a chance to help create a community where children like Emma, James and William could grow up without facing prejudice for their unconventional origins. That was compelling. They requested time to think about the offer, and Whitfield's group departed with promises to return in a week. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, they discussed the proposal with characteristic thoroughness that had become their way of making important decisions. Emma, now walking confidently and beginning to form sentences, surprised them by asking, "Why men want our house?" Sarah smiled, realizing her daughter, for Emma was truly their daughter now, legally and emotionally, was more perceptive than they had credited. "They don't want our house, sweetheart. They want to build a new place where lots of families can live together." James, ever practical, wanted to know if that meant more children to play with. William, sensitive to emotional undercurrents, seemed to sense something important was being discussed and stayed close to Sarah throughout the conversation. During the following days, unexpected visitors helped inform their decision. Thomas Anderson arrived with news that he and Catherine Sullivan were planning to marry and establish a permanent medical practice in the region. They were enthusiastic about the planned community idea, seeing it as a chance to create something truly special. The decision came from unexpected source. Emma, playing with a small wooden horse Ben had carved for her, looked up during one of their evening discussions and announced, "Want more babies here?" When Sarah asked what she meant, Emma explained in her limited vocabulary that she wanted more children like herself, children who needed families. She had somehow intuited that a larger community might mean more opportunities to rescue children in need. That simple statement from a 3-year-old crystallized everything for Ben and Sarah. They weren't just being offered a business opportunity, they were being given a chance to extend the love that had saved their family to others who might need it. They accepted Whitfield's proposition, but with conditions. The new town would be called New Silverbrook, in honor of the place where their journey had begun. It would have ordinances protecting children's welfare, encouraging adoption, and preventing discrimination based on Civil War allegiances or immigrant origins. Most importantly, any profits from land sales would partially fund an orphanage that could serve as model for other Western communities. Construction began that summer, and New Silverbrook flourished quickly into a living demonstration that different groups could work together to create something better than any could achieve alone. The winter of 1878 came with more than snow and freezing wind. It brought letters and visitors that transported echoes of conflicts the Crawford family thought they had left behind. The first warning came through an urgent telegram from Helena, delivered by a courier who had ridden hard through blizzard conditions to reach New Silverbrook. Sarah read the message with growing alarm. Ashworth family filing federal lawsuit, claiming fraudulent adoption proceedings, demanding return of children plus damages. Case scheduled. Helena Federal Court, January 15th. Advise immediate legal consultation. Samuel Morrison, attorney. Ben felt familiar cold settle in his chest, not Montana winter cold, but the cold of impending battle. He had hoped their legal victory had ended the threat from Emma, James, and William's biological father's family, but clearly the Ashworths weren't finished. "They waited until we were established, happy, settled," Sarah said, her voice carrying bitter understanding. "Now they strike when we have more to lose." Dr. Hartwell, who was dining with the family when the telegram arrived, studied the message over his reading glasses. "This isn't just about the children anymore," he observed. "Your success here, the community you've built, the model you've created, it threatens certain people's vision of how society should be ordered." During the following weeks, more disturbing news arrived through various channels. Margaret Whitmore, despite her earlier disgrace, had reinvented herself as champion of traditional family values and was touring eastern cities, giving lectures about the moral decay of frontier communities that allowed unnatural family arrangements. Thomas Anderson brought word that land speculators connected to the original Ashworth property in California were circulating stories about New Silverbrook being a haven for undesirable elements, code words for the integrated community that welcomed people regardless of their war allegiances, national origins, or economic status. But the most troubling development was personal. A stranger had been asking questions about the Crawford family in neighboring towns, not obviously threatening, but persistent in his inquiries about the children, the family's routines, their property's defensibility. "Professional scout," Thomas concluded after hearing descriptions. "Someone's paying to get detailed information about your vulnerabilities." Ben and Sarah made a decision that pained them but seemed necessary. They temporarily sent Emma, James, and William to stay with Jake Morrison at his remote trading post. The children, now almost 4 years old, didn't understand why they couldn't stay home, and their confused tears nearly broke their parents' resolve. "We'll bring you back as soon as it's safe," Sarah promised, hugging each child tightly before they departed with Dr. Hartwell, who would stay with them during their temporary exile. "This is just for a little while." Emma, always the most perceptive, touched Sarah's wet cheek and asked, "Mama sad?" "Mama's protecting you," Sarah managed to respond. "Sometimes loving someone means sending them away to keep them safe." With the children gone, Ben and Sarah threw themselves intensively into preparing for the legal battle ahead. They gathered every document related to the adoptions, compiled testimonies from community members, and worked with Samuel Morrison to build a defense that would address not just legal technicalities, but the broader principle at stake. But the legal case was only part of their challenge. One night in December, Ben discovered signs that someone had been watching their house, footprints in fresh snow that circled the property, stopping at points that offered clear views through windows. He began sleeping lightly, rifle beside the bed, listening for sounds that didn't belong to winter night's normal rhythms. The attack, when it came, was more subtle than Ben had anticipated. Instead of direct violence, their opponents chose economic warfare. Suppliers suddenly cancelled contracts with New Silverbrook businesses. The territorial bank that had been financing community expansion abruptly called in all loans. Orders for crops and livestock were mysteriously withdrawn. The response was swift and creative. New Silverbrook organized its own economic network, bartering goods and services internally when external markets were blocked. Jake Morrison expanded his trading routes to bypass hostile intermediaries. Families pooled resources to help neighbors whose individual businesses were under attack. But the pressure was taking its toll. Some families, especially those with young children, began discussing leaving for safer, less controversial locations. The unity that had characterized the community began showing cracks under sustained assault. As January approached, bringing both the court date and increasingly bold surveillance of their property, Ben found himself thinking about that morning when he had broken ice with bare hands to save 3 dying babies. The stakes seemed just as high now, but the battlefield was more complex. One evening, as he and Sarah planned for the trial ahead, she asked a question that had weighed on both their minds. "What if we lose?" Ben took her hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of hard work and determination. "Then we fight again, and again, and again, until our children are safe and our community can exist without fear." But privately, both understood that some battles, once lost, couldn't be fought again. The trial ahead would determine more than just custody of 3 children. It would decide whether their vision of a more inclusive, compassionate society could survive in a world that often preferred familiar divisions to uncomfortable unity. Helena's federal courthouse had never witnessed a case that attracted such national attention. Journalists from New York, Chicago, and San Francisco arrived to cover what newspapers were calling the trial that will define the American family. The streets around the courthouse filled with Crawford family supporters, curious onlookers, and some protesters carrying signs denouncing the degradation of traditional family values. Ben and Sarah entered the courthouse hand in hand, followed by an entourage including Dr. Hartwell, Thomas, and Catherine Anderson, and dozens of New Silverbrook residents who had made the difficult journey through winter conditions to show solidarity. They had deliberately left Emma, James, and William with Jake Morrison, reasoning that children shouldn't be exposed to potentially traumatic proceedings. The Ashworth's lead attorney was an imposing man named Cornelius Blackwood, known for his victories in cases involving property rights and moral standards. He had spent weeks building a case that portrayed Ben as an unstable ex-Confederate soldier who had exploited a vulnerable young woman's desperation to gain access to children he could use as propaganda tools for his subversive community experiment. Samuel Morrison, defending Ben and Sarah, was a contrast, a quiet, methodical man who relied more on facts than theatrics. But his opening statement carried emotional weight that filled the courtroom. This case is about more than custody of 3 children. It's about whether love, sacrifice, and demonstrated care can triumph over prejudice, privilege, and the desire to control what constitutes a legitimate family. The prosecution's case relied heavily on technicalities and character assassination. They argued that Sarah had lied about being an orphan. She had distant relatives she had never mentioned. That Ben's Confederate service proved his moral unfitness, and that the adoption proceedings had been conducted improperly because they were done in territorial rather than federal court. More damaging, Blackwood produced witnesses, former Ashworth estate employees who claimed Sarah had stolen items before leaving, that she had been mentally unstable after the birth, and that the children would be better served by proper guardians rather than frontier experimenters. But Morrison's defense was devastating in its systematic dismantling of the prosecution's arguments. Dr. Hartwell testified about the children's medical condition when rescued, making clear they would have died without immediate intervention. Catherine Sullivan described the devoted care she had witnessed. Thomas Anderson spoke about Ben's character and integrity during dangerous situations. The turning point came when Morrison called a surprise witness, a former maid from the Ashworth estate in California who had traveled cross-country to testify. Mary O'Brien, an elderly Irish woman with nothing to gain and much to lose by defying her former employers, told a story that silenced the courtroom. Miss Sarah was a sweet girl, kind to everyone, she said in a strong brogue. Young Master Richard forced himself upon her repeatedly. When she became with child, the family was furious, not because of what he'd done, but because she might tell others. They planned to get rid of her and the babies from the moment they learned she was pregnant. Under oath, Mary described overheard conversations where family members discussed solving the problem permanently and referred to the children as evidence that needed to be eliminated. She had tried to warn Sarah, but by the time she learned of specific plans, the girl had already been sent away. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Judge Harrison Caldwell, a stern man known for strict interpretation of law, called for order repeatedly. Blackwood's objections became increasingly desperate as his carefully constructed narrative crumbled. But the defense's most powerful moment came when Sarah herself took the stand. Speaking clearly and without notes, she told her story again, but this time focusing not on trauma she had endured, but on healing she had found. "I don't claim to be a perfect mother or wife," she said, her voice carrying throughout the silent courtroom. "But I know I love these children with every breath in my body. I know my husband saved their lives when no one else cared enough to try. And I know we've created a home where they're safe, cherished, and free to grow into whoever God intends them to be." The trial lasted 5 days. When the jury retired to deliberate, Ben and Sarah sat in the hallway holding hands, surrounded by their chosen family, waiting for a decision that would determine not just their future, but the fate of 3 children who had become symbols of hope for thousands of people they'd never met. As evening fell over Helena, the sound of footsteps in the corridor announced the jury was returning. 12 men who would decide whether love was enough to overcome law, whether character could triumph over privilege, whether 3 children saved from ice could continue living in the warmth of a family that had chosen them above all else. The silence that fell over the courtroom when the jury returned was so absolute, you could hear a pin drop. 12 men took their seats with faces revealing nothing, their expressions carefully neutral, after days of deliberation that had kept Helena in suspense. Judge Caldwell called for order, though the courtroom was already silent as a church during prayer. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked, his voice echoing throughout the packed courtroom. The jury foreman, a weathered farmer named Jacob Nielsen, who had settled in Montana after the Civil War, slowly rose. "We have, Your Honor." But before he could speak, a commotion at the back of the courtroom interrupted proceedings. Doors burst open, and a young man in travel-stained clothes stumbled forward, followed by a woman in expensive but mud-spattered dress. The disturbance was so unexpected that even bailiffs were caught off guard. "Stop!" the young man shouted, his voice carrying desperation that silenced everyone. "Please, Your Honor, I have information that must be heard before any verdict is read." Judge Caldwell's expression darkened. "Sir, this court is in session. Remove yourself or be held in contempt." But the woman stepped forward, removing her traveling bonnet to reveal elegant features and graying hair arranged in a style that spoke of wealth and status. "Your Honor," she said in a voice accustomed to being obeyed, "I am Eleanor Ashworth. This is my son, Richard Ashworth, Jr. We've traveled from California to speak the truth before a terrible injustice is committed." The courtroom exploded in shocked whispers. Cornelius Blackwood, the Ashworth family attorney, looked like he'd seen a ghost. Samuel Morrison gripped Ben's shoulder, uncertain whether this development was salvation or disaster. Judge Caldwell considered for a long moment, then made a decision that would change everything. "I'll allow testimony, but briefly. The jury will remain seated, but not consider this in their deliberations unless I specifically instruct them to do so." Eleanor Ashworth approached the witness stand with dignity that couldn't quite conceal underlying turmoil. Her son, Richard Jr., remained standing nearby, his face bearing the expression of a man wrestling with internal demons. "Mrs. Ashworth," Judge Caldwell said formally, "why have you traveled across the country to appear in this court uninvited?" Eleanor's voice was clear and strong, though her hands trembled slightly. "Because I've learned things about my family that I can no longer remain silent about. Because 3 innocent children and 2 good people are being destroyed by lies that my family has perpetuated." She turned to face the courtroom, her eyes finding Ben and Sarah before continuing. "Miss Mitchell," Mrs. Crawford now, "told the truth about what happened in our employ. My son forced himself upon her repeatedly while she was vulnerable and under our protection. When we learned she was pregnant, rather than accepting responsibility, our family chose to protect our reputation at any cost." Richard Jr. stepped forward, his voice barely audible, but carrying throughout the silent courtroom. "I was a coward," he said simply. "I committed crimes against Miss Mitchell, and then allowed my family to compound those crimes by trying to destroy the evidence, including ensuring that her children didn't survive." The confession that followed revealed a conspiracy that went far beyond what anyone had imagined. The Ashworth family hadn't simply tried to discredit Sarah and reclaim the children. They had orchestrated a campaign to destroy New Silverbrook, bought witnesses to lie under oath, and even hired men to intimidate or potentially harm anyone who threatened their version of events. "But why?" Judge Caldwell asked, clearly struggling to understand the motivation behind such elaborate malice. Eleanor Ashworth's answer chilled the courtroom. "Because allowing these children to thrive, allowing this community to succeed, allowing former enemies to work together and help orphaned children, it challenges everything our kind of people have always believed about who deserves happiness and who doesn't." She gestured toward Ben and Sarah. "This man saved 3 dying babies and raised them as his own. This woman endured terrible treatment and still found strength to love again. Their community welcomes people regardless of their past mistakes or allegiances. For families like ours, who base our power on keeping others divided and dependent, examples like theirs are existential threats." The silence that followed was broken by sounds of weeping from various parts of the courtroom. Even some of the reporters, trained to maintain professional detachment, were visibly moved. Richard Jr. approached the witness stand. "I want to renounce any claim to those children," he said, his voice growing stronger. "They were saved by better people than I'll ever be. They deserve to stay with people who actually love them." Judge Caldwell looked at the jury, then at the packed courtroom, then at Ben and Sarah, who sat stunned by the unprecedented turn of events. "Mr. Morrison," he said to their attorney, "do you wish to enter this testimony into the record?" "We do, Your Honor." "Mr. Blackwood, do you wish to cross-examine these witnesses?" Blackwood, his case completely demolished, simply shook his head. Judge Caldwell then made a decision that was both legal and deeply human. "Given the new testimony, I'm instructing the jury to consider not just the original charges, but the broader context of what has been revealed here. You may retire again to deliberate, taking into account everything you've now heard." But the jury foreman stood again. "Your Honor, after what we've just heard, we don't need to deliberate further. Our verdict remains the same as it was before these revelations. We find for the defendants on all charges, but now we also recommend that the court consider charges against those who have perpetrated fraud upon this court and attempted to harm innocent children." The explosion of joy that erupted in the courtroom lasted several minutes before Judge Caldwell could restore order. Ben and Sarah found themselves surrounded by weeping friends, cheering supporters, and even some of the journalists who had abandoned professional objectivity to celebrate what felt like justice finally served. But the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was waiting at Jake Morrison's trading post, where 3 children who had once nearly frozen to death were about to learn they could finally, permanently, safely come home to the family that had never stopped fighting for them. 3 days later, when they arrived at Jake's post and saw Emma, James, and William running toward them through the snow, their laughter echoing across the valley like music, Ben and Sarah knew that some victories were worth any price. The spring of 1879 came to New Silverbrook like nature's celebration. 3 years had passed since 3 babies nearly froze in the Clearwater River, and the transformation, both of the children and of the community that grew around their salvation, was nothing short of miraculous. Emma, now a 5-year-old girl with fierce, independent personality, had become a natural leader among the town's children, Her reddish hair caught sunlight like fire as she organized elaborate games that included children from all backgrounds: Irish, German, Scandinavian, freed slaves who had migrated west, and even some Native American children whose families had chosen to integrate with the growing community. Her crescent moon birthmark was now considered lucky by other children, who frequently traced its outline before attempting brave feats. James developed into an engineer-minded boy who could be found most days helping Ben with construction projects around the expanding town. At 5, he already understood basic carpentry and took pride in creating small toys for younger children. His methodical approach to problem-solving reminded everyone of Ben, but his quick smile and infectious laughter were purely his own. William had become a gentle soul who seemed to possess intuitive understanding of when people needed comfort. Dr. Hartwell often commented that the boy had natural healing instincts, always appearing at bedsides during illness or offering quiet support during difficult times. His early fragility had given way to quiet strength that drew people to him like flowers turning towards sunlight. Sarah flourished as head teacher of New Silverbrook School, where children learned not just reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also lessons in cooperation, empathy, and the value of diverse perspectives. Her classroom became a model for progressive education that attracted attention from educators across the territory. She was particularly proud that all 3 of her children could switch effortlessly between English and basic Irish Gaelic, and that they understood stories from many cultural traditions. Ben found himself serving as unofficial mayor of the town that had grown to over 200 families. His reputation as someone who could mediate between different groups, combined with his proven commitment to protecting vulnerable people, made him a natural choice for leadership. He'd also established a successful horse breeding operation that supplied cavalry units across the territory, proving that former Confederates could contribute productively to the Union's continuing development. Dr. Hartwell had become more than community physician. He was keeper of collective memory, who documented not just medical histories, but the stories that made New Silverbrook unique. He was particularly fascinated by how quickly children adapted to integrated living, noting that prejudices seemed to skip generations when children grew up playing together rather than learning to fear differences. But the most significant development of spring was news that the Transcontinental Railroad would indeed pass through their area, bringing both opportunities and challenges that would test everything they'd built. On a warm May afternoon, as Ben sat on his porch watching Emma teach James and William how to braid flower crowns, a skill she'd learned from Catherine Anderson, a familiar figure appeared on the road leading into town. Margaret Whitmore, now noticeably older and walking with a cane, approached slowly, but with evident determination. Ben's first instinct was defensive, but something in the former antagonist's posture suggested this wasn't a hostile visit. Sarah emerged from the house having spotted the visitor, her expression wary but curious. "Mrs. Whitmore," Sarah said carefully, "this is unexpected." The elderly woman stopped several feet away, her eyes taking in the prosperous household, the healthy children, the evidence of a life well lived. When she spoke, her voice carried none of its former bitterness. "I've come to apologize," she said simply, "and to ask forgiveness for things I now understand were motivated by my own pain rather than any legitimate concern for these children's welfare." The conversation that followed revealed that Margaret had spent the intervening years traveling, seeing other communities, and slowly understanding how her grief over losing her own children to disease had twisted into resentment toward anyone who seemed to have found the happiness she'd been denied. "What you built here," she continued, gesturing toward the thriving community visible from the porch, "is what I wish I'd been wise enough to support from the beginning. These children didn't need protection from you. They needed protection from people like me, who couldn't see past our own hurt to recognize goodness when it appeared." Emma, who had been listening from nearby, approached the elderly woman with a flower crown she'd been making. "For you," she said simply, offering the gift with the generosity that characterized her generation of New Silverbrook children. Margaret accepted the crown with tears streaming down her face, placing it on her grey hair with a dignity that transformed both her appearance and her spirit. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank all of you for showing a bitter old woman that it's never too late to learn better ways of living." That night, as the family gathered for their traditional evening story time, Ben reflected on how far they'd traveled, not just geographically, but emotionally and spiritually. 3 children who had once been considered disposable were now the heart of a community that valued every individual's potential. Sarah, sitting beside him as she read a fairy tale she'd translated from Irish into English, paused to look at their children, Emma leaning against Ben's shoulder, James sprawled on the rug at their feet, William curled in Sarah's lap like a contented cat. "Do you think they'll remember?" she asked softly, echoing a question she'd posed years earlier. Ben considered the question, watching the faces of 3 children who had taught him that family isn't determined by blood, but by choice, commitment, and love. "I hope they remember they were chosen," he said finally, "that when the world tried to throw them away, people who loved them fought to keep them. And I hope that when they have children of their own, they'll choose to build a world where no child ever faces what they faced." Outside, the sounds of New Silverbrook settling into night, laughter from the tavern, music from a distant parlour, the gentle murmur of families preparing for sleep, created a symphony of contentment that spoke of dreams realized and communities built on foundation of compassion. Emma's sleepy voice broke the peaceful quiet. "Papa, Mama, will you tell us tomorrow about when we were tiny babies?" "Always," Sarah promised. "We'll always tell you that story, because it's a story about how love can triumph over anything, even ice cold enough to stop hearts from beating." As Ben carried sleeping William to bed and Sarah guided drowsy Emma and James toward their room, he thought about that morning 3 years ago when he'd broken ice with bare hands to save 3 strangers. He hadn't known then that he was really saving himself, creating a family, and beginning a story that would inspire an entire community. Some rescues, he now understood, save everyone involved. Outside the window, snowflakes began to fall gently, not the harsh, killing snow of that terrible winter, but soft, peaceful snow that promised renewal and reminded them that even the coldest seasons eventually give way to spring. The circle was complete, but their story would continue, in the lives of 3 children who would carry forward the lessons of love, resilience, and community spirit that had transformed a remote corner of Montana territory into something approaching paradise.